Sikkim 365 and Baylor Plus have teamed up to bring Baylor fans the ultimate content bundle. You can sign up now for $17.99 a month, a $5 monthly savings, and get instant access to all premium content on both websites. For more information, visit either sikkim365.com or baylorplus.com today. What's up, Baylor family? Welcome to Inside Baylor Sports, the official daily podcast of Baylor Athletics. It's Tuesday, September 16th, and today, Grace and I will preview Baylor's Big 12 opener against Colorado. The Bears and Buffaloes will kick off at 7 p.m. Central Time, and the game will be aired on Fox. It's actually Colorado's homecoming game, which means it should be a great and probably a pretty tough environment, not to even mention the elevation that you play up there in Boulder. The Buffs are 2-1 on the season with victories over North Dakota State, 31-26, which was a very entertaining game if you happen to watch that to kind of kick off the college football season. And Colorado State just last weekend, 28-9. The single loss comes at Nebraska, 28-10. And man, it's a really obviously polarizing program with Colorado right now. But what are your initial thoughts on the Buffs, and what do you expect Baylor can see, and vice versa, what Baylor fans can or what Colorado fans can expect to see from Baylor this week?
This is going to be a crazy environment. I mean, this is also Colorado's first Big 12 game. So, I mean, there's a lot of intrigue to this. There's going to be a lot of fanfare, a lot of lead up that I think will be really cool. To get a primetime game is awesome. As Arando alluded to today, they're getting this primetime matchup because of Deion Sanders and because of Colorado. And that's great. It's great for the conference, great for Baylor also to be on, nationally televised game in that late window. It's really, really cool. So I think in general, this is a game where I think we're still trying to figure out both of these teams. I think there are some signs of, growth probably on both sides to a certain extent. But I do think they also both have clear kind of deficiencies in ways that the other can maybe take advantage of them, or at least question marks that we have about both of them going into this game. But lots of star power, of course, on the Colorado side. They have two guys who are probably going to be top 10 picks in Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter. On the Baylor side, it's a team that's just improving, trying to improve week by week, and fighting for Dave Aranda as Dave Aranda is trying to make sure that, he's at this Baylor program for a long time and continuing to try to build a culture with the Bears in Waco. Yeah,
very, very similar but different outlooks for both programs right now. I think the similarities are just in general about where do these specific teams go. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about mostly today. I know you'll have plenty of your talking points, but I just have a list of things and I'll start with this one, and it's something that Baylor fans will identify with. Most of the country identifies Colorado with this, and it's both teams went heavy in the portal to bring in playmakers once again. Colorado specifically, once again, Baylor's just kind of ramping up to this. We've seen it at the receiver position for Colorado. We've seen it on the defensive line, specifically all the guys. It was all over the place for Colorado. And I think that's, as these teams figure out their identities, those transfer portal players, are they panning out? Are they not panning out? What is happening in all those areas? And obviously, Colorado offensive line was a big question mark for them, bringing a ton of transfers there, bringing a true freshman that's basically starting at left tackle or is starting at left tackle for them. A lot of new faces. But overall, what have you seen from Colorado's transfers? And obviously we'll get it. We've talked plenty about Baylor's transfers, but how these two teams compare in those two areas.
I think it's relatively close. Now, I do want to say Colorado really strongly relies on the transfer portal. It's a little bit different. Baylor kind of more so filling in the gaps and trying to add high-end talent, guys that are, difference makers, but it's not accounting for the whole team. Whereas Colorado in some spots, it's just, this is entirely a transfer portal football team in some regards. And so I think that makes it tough, right? Because you see a lot more of Colorado's transfers on the field. You see a lot more of kind of the deficiencies that they've had there, the swings and misses. And then you also see the, guys that they've had a lot of success with, such as Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter. They were both transfers at one time as well. And so I think that's all kind of leading to this point where it goes, okay, this is where you kind of have that question, right? Do you want to be a full transfer portal team, or do you want to be a team that develops, but then you also attack the transfer portal to kind of add key pieces to the roster? I think that's where these two teams differentiate, at least right now. And I think Baylor's strategy is the more effective one. I think that's been proven throughout college football, that you can take quite a few transfers, but you also have to develop the talent on your roster, because it's important to build that cohesiveness. It's important to develop guys in your system and in your scheme. And culture wise, you got to have guys that have been around the program. They're completely bought in. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of the biggest differentiator between the two when it comes to the transfer portal. I will also say the only guy that I know Baylor had a head-to-head with that was a pretty intense head-to-head was LeJontay Wester, who's a really talented wide receiver for Colorado. Colorado's got 3 of them that are just really 4 of them, if you include Will Shepherd in there. They got 4 guys that can really, really play at wide receiver, and Wester is one of them who Baylor wanted pretty badly.
Yeah, and I think the tough part with the portal is that in college football, you have 12 games to get it right. If you're wasting a third of the season or even a fourth of the season trying to figure out that identity of all your transfers, then it becomes an issue, because you get later and later into the season trying to develop these guys, figure out their roles. And I think, not that Colorado can eventually go on to win 10 games this year, but I think that it's almost burdensome to an extent, because you are truly trying to figure guys out. You don't know the depth per se, top to bottom, for your own team. And we've seen that with Baylor's offense, of trying to figure out where guys fit in, what are their roles. Offensive line wise, you want those guys to come in and they've played together, they've worked in the same system together. Colorado is going to battle those. It's how quickly can they get those figured out. And I feel like the more guys that you have, the longer that takes. And so for Baylor, who did, relatively speaking, bring in more guys this particular offseason, they're going to take a little bit longer to figure out. They're not plugging into the same system. You want to find good fits in the portal, but they don't have nearly as many guys as Colorado did. So I think there is a little bit of advantage there for Baylor specifically in terms of figuring out the identity of this particular team. Now, Colorado's high-end potential might be greater because of the guys that they had, the guys they currently have on campus that were previous transfers in previous classes. But right now, you just feel like Baylor stuff's kind of coming together a little bit more quickly for this particular team. And that starts, you mentioned the skill position players, the receiver specifically, Sanders at quarterback. But I think where another similarity between both of the teams is that after the most recent game, Colorado against Colorado State, at Colorado State, and Baylor versus Air Force, I've been reading quite a bit, and there was some optimism for Colorado's standpoint that they felt better about their running game. We know how what Baylor did against Air Force with 230 yards on 38 carries. Colorado only had 19 carries for 109 yards, which I found was interesting. While expressing optimism, I guess by comparison, that is pretty good for what they've done for the rest of the season. So both teams are looking for a running game. They need that to get going. Baylor found theirs a little bit more against Air Force, but there is optimism for Colorado in their run game coming off that game against Colorado State.
So Colorado State's not a good football team. They're just not. I think according to every metric, they're outside the top 110. Now, so is Air Force. So both those teams squarely bad. I think we can probably say at this time. And so for Colorado to be talking a lot about going 19 for 109 yards is pretty interesting. I really don't see that as being some sort of consistent trend that they're really able to run the ball at a high level. I mean, against North Dakota State, they were 23 for 59 yards, and against Nebraska, they had 22 carries for 16 yards. So I think Baylor is much closer to being Nebraska than the other two teams that they played. I think in general, Baylor is at a point where, you kind of look at them and you go, okay, where's the strength of the defense up front with the defensive line and the linebackers? And so I think in general, that's not really an area that I'm very concerned about with Colorado. Now, maybe going forward when they see better matchups, maybe they're able to actually run the football, which they haven't really been able to do since Dion got there. So, I mean, that is an area of intrigue. I think it's an area that Baylor holds a clear advantage as far as stopping the run. And then I'd also say, on the flip side, you mentioned Baylor getting back to running the ball. We saw Bryson Washington this week. We saw Dominic Richardson looking like he's at least getting closer to healthy. Maybe he'll take on a bigger role. I think Baylor holds a decent advantage there as well. I mean, Colorado is 82nd in run defense. They gave up a lot of, I mean, they've given up yards to pretty much everyone, but they gave up 149 yards to Nebraska, 4.3 yards per carry on the ground, 157 yards to North Dakota State, 3.7 yards on the ground, and then to Colorado State, 131 yards rushing and 4.2 yards per carry. So you look at that and you go, okay, well, maybe those teams run the football well, right? Well, Colorado State is 71st in the nation in rushing offense, and Nebraska is 57th. So pretty much in my eyes, the way that I look at this, there's no way Colorado's rushing for 100 yards on Baylor unless they just get some sort of 70-yard touchdown play or something like that. And then there's really no reason why Baylor shouldn't run for at least 150 yards on offense. And if you're telling me those two things going into the game, I would say that's a pretty clear advantage for Baylor heading into this contest. But that does lead me to say, but Baylor's got to play up to their level if they're going to be able to actually accomplish those things. But things set up really nicely for them to do that.
Yeah, something to note there on Colorado's rushing game. They were missing Dallin Hayden, who's their number one running back by all cases. But truthfully, Colorado doesn't want to run the football, which leads me into my next point. Like, they will utilize the run, but they're not going to do it a ton because I think they know that that's not where they're going to make their offense move. But that leads us to the perimeter play for Colorado. And that's, you mentioned it already. I mean, Travis Hunter kind of leading the way, but they have a very talented skill position group on the perimeter. They want to go, Dave Aranda mentioned in his press conference, like them to go 5 wide with 5 receivers is not unheard of. Like, they're going to do it pretty regularly, put you in binds. And that means that Baylor will have to control the run game with basically 5 guys in the box. A lot of times you want to be careful about the pressure because Shador will get it into the playmaker's hands when there are mismatches if you try to bring guys into the box and take away from coverage. Nebraska did a great job of that against Colorado, and is basically say, we're going to take away the pass game. We're going to stop your run, your rushing game with our front 5. They didn't blitz a lot. They rarely brought more than 4 players, and Baylor's going to have to implement a similar plan if they want to keep up with Colorado's receivers. And on the flip side, Baylor's receivers, I think there's not as much proven talent, but there is high upside still. And that's why I think both teams are similar in that way. I just think Colorado, obviously, because of their proven commodities, have the advantage in this area. Now, it's not direct. It's not Baylor's receivers versus Colorado's receivers, but they are similarities in the way these teams are built.
There are, to be clear, though, we are talking about a difference in NFL talent level. I think it's important to mention that. I mean, we're talking about Shador Sanders, who's going to be a top 10 pick, maybe the number 1 pick. We'll see. And then Travis Hunter, who's a consensus top 5 pick. Baylor doesn't have any guys like that. And so there is a huge difference there, just kind of talent. And I think that's important to mention. But I will say, I think the important thing when I kind of look through the numbers and things like that, as far as Colorado's passing attack, which is how they're going to try to win this game. It's how they're going to try to win pretty much every game this year. They might have a couple 100-yard rushing performances, but they want their best player to have the ball in his hands, and they want him to go make plays throwing the ball to their other best players. And so that's what they're going to do. Now, against Nebraska, that didn't work out. They only threw for 244 yards, 1 touchdown, and Shador Sanders completed just 57.5% of his passes. In the other 2 games, he's gone pretty much crazy. I mean, 445 yards, 4 touchdowns against North Dakota State, 310 yards, 4 touchdowns against Colorado State. His completion percentage was 75% in those 2 games. So you can see the stark contrast there between him being very comfortable in the pocket, him having opportunities to take shots downfield, them creating explosive plays, versus when they played Nebraska and he was just getting, he was getting attacked all game. I think Nebraska ended up with 6 sacks, but even bigger than that, they had 24 pressures against Colorado. That number is crazy. And like you mentioned, they were really bringing, 4 guys. They dropped a lot of guys in coverage, and they were just getting after Sanders in those one-on-one matchups because Colorado's offensive line continues to have problems. So I think that's the key. Everyone keeps talking about, Baylor's secondary is unproven. And I know I keep talking about it because they are. And there are opportunities, I think, for Colorado to potentially expose them and take shots and create explosive plays. But if Baylor's pass rush is continuously getting in the backfield and making Sanders uncomfortable, that puts Baylor in a very good position. And I think as of right now, we feel like that could be a strength of Baylor's defense. But I would also say I don't think we know that quite yet. I think there's still a question there. And if there's a question there, and then there's also the question in the secondary, that's why this game is very intriguing, because frankly, it could go completely sideways on Baylor defensively in this game, or it could just be another statement that, oh, they can defend multiple types of offenses, which bodes really well going forward in Big 12 play.
Yeah, so to put this in comparison, Colorado's offense has given up 2.67 sacks per game. That ranks 15th in the Big 12. So the gap, though, Baylor ranks 13th in sacks given up in the Big 12, but they've only given up 1.33 sacks per game. So Colorado has more than doubled sacks given up. And I will say that I think that Colorado's faced a tougher overall schedule. The teams that they played with Nebraska and obviously North Dakota State, but to give up 2.67 sacks per game, and that's what you're relying on, and especially when a lot of times they're giving it up in situations where they have numbers in the boxes and they shouldn't be giving them up, is a major discrepancy. And so Baylor's going to have to do that. They're going to have to cover well, but I think they're going to have help. I think that David Rennick can implement a scheme in this particular game where there's a lot of guys in coverage. You cover from multiple levels at the linebacker position. The personnel that they have there to cover multiple levels is much stronger than it was a year ago. You talk about guys like Keaton Thomas and Rara Dilworth who can run from the linebacker position. They didn't necessarily have that last year when they were chasing guys all over the field. And then up front, Baylor just has not faced a passing team this year. I mean, they truly haven't. You talk about Air Force, Utah wasn't willing to do it a lot. After Cam Rising went out, they just wanted to run the football. And then obviously Tarleton State without their starting quarterback, no one has tested them throwing the football. And while it does create concerns about the secondary, I think it also has just prevented what I believe will be a pretty strong pass rushing front from Baylor to get going. And that starts with the 3-down linemen, not just bringing secondary level blitzers, guys like Jackie Marshall. They're going to have to be disruptive whenever Shador's back there sitting in the pocket. They can't lose contain because he can still beat you in terms of getting out of the pockets and making throws. He's not going to beat you with his legs a ton, but they're going to have to keep him contained and make that pocket collapse around him. And there's guys in coverage. It's the same idea what Matt Rule did at Nebraska. Keep him contained, make him throw into small windows, get him on the ground when you can. And the offense just became completely limited when they faced Nebraska because of that. And it starts with not having a run game that you can rely on. So that's the way that you kind of eliminate those skill positions. And even to a great extent, Colorado State did it early in that game. They were at one point, Sanders was averaging like 5 yards per pass attempt. Everything was underneath. They were just controlling the explosive plays, and it kept Colorado State in that game probably longer than you would think based on the score. It's Colorado did separate, but the way that they kind of confined the Colorado offense early was encouraging. And truthfully, that's why Colorado probably ran the ball the way they did for 19 carries for 190 yards and became optimistic about it, because Colorado State said, you can have that if you want it. We're just not going to beat deep. So I'm anxious to see Baylor's secondary, but also their pass rush in this game.
Right. And that's a key to me, because Colorado is 77th in pass yards per completion. So they are explosive at times, but they throw the ball so much that it does skew their numbers down, because their best run game has been throwing the football. And I just think, you mentioned, Colorado's feeling a little bit better about their run game. This stat jumped out to me because I gave a lot of credit to North Dakota State, basically based on kind of how I've seen them in the past. But Colorado ran for 59 yards against North Dakota State. North Dakota State this past week gave up 270 rushing yards to East Tennessee State, who lost Appalachian State by 4 touchdowns.
Yeah.
I don't know that North Dakota State's all that good, at least not right now, like not at this point in the season. And Colorado couldn't run on them at all. That's a problem. And that's a bit of a red flag for me as far as saying, okay, they had a 100-yard rushing performance. Now that's just kind of who they are. I don't really know about that. They're still 129th in rush yards per game. And like you said, yes, they played Nebraska. Nebraska's a good team, but I don't think Nebraska is better than Utah. And so I do think Baylor's faced the best team between the two. And so we'll see kind of how that bears out. I will say Nebraska defensively is probably a tick up from Baylor a little bit. I think they're a little bit better than Baylor's defense, but I think Baylor's offense could potentially be better than Nebraska's, which is kind of the other side of the coin here. But regardless, Baylor is much closer to being that Nebraska team, or maybe being a little better than Nebraska, than they are to being North Dakota State or Colorado State. And Colorado had a lot of problems dealing with Nebraska on the road.
Yeah. So that to me, the run game might be the differentiating factor in this particular game. And that starts with the running back, starts with the offensive line, because if Baylor can control that offensive line in terms of rushing the football, if Colorado attempts to do it all, they might not even attempt to do it. But if they can control the run game or feel confident in controlling the run game, drop guys into coverage, make Sanders pick them apart going down the field, don't get beat deep, be conscious of where those receivers are. And you know that Dave Aranda will have this game schemed up, because you look back to games like Ole Miss in 21, even Oklahoma against Caleb Williams in 21. And obviously that was a great defense, but schematically in those games, they took away the strengths of the offense entirely. They said, you're going to have to beat us in a different way. And I see this kind of being a similar opportunity for Dave Aranda. Now, can his personnel hold up? That's to be determined. And that's what it's going to come down to. But it starts up front, because I think that Baylor is going to have the opportunity to run the football if it wants to. And you just hope that, let me take that back. I think Colorado is going to give up having numbers in the box to prevent the pass right now. That's my assumption. Maybe they could go a completely different way. And Baylor's going to have to take advantage of that with their offensive line and running backs. You think Bryson Washington can have a similar game, similar performance? You mentioned Dominic Richardson coming back. Those are the keys to the game right now to me. If Baylor can control time of possession, move the ball down the field consistently, and then stop Colorado's running game, is going to allow that secondary to play at a higher level, because there's just going to be more guys in coverage.
We're going to dive into this with our keys a little bit more. But for me, quite frankly, it's all about, can Baylor's front four create a lot of pressure and get Sanders uncomfortable? That is 100% probably the biggest factor in whether this is going to be a good defensive performance or not. I like Baylor's secondary. I like some of the pieces, but I also don't think that they're going to be able to hold up if you're giving Sanders 3 seconds or 4 seconds to throw the football each time. I don't see that happening. He's too good of a player. His receivers are too good as well. And then on the other end, it's Baylor running the football. Baylor's got to be able to run the football. I mentioned other teams have been successful running the ball on Colorado. There is no reason why Baylor shouldn't be able to run for 150 yards in this game. There's really not, especially with Bryson Washington back, with what we saw this past week, with the fact that I think this offense is going to continue to expand a little bit as they get more comfortable around a quarterback. We'll see who the starter is. We'll probably get into that here in a minute. But I think the other thing that really stood out to me when I was kind of looking at what Colorado has done in these first 3 games, against Nebraska and against North Dakota State, they allowed quarterbacks to complete 76% of their passes. And it wasn't huge totals. North Dakota State got 292 on them, so they threw it pretty well. But Nebraska only had 185 yards passing. But the problem is, it was basically all completions. Giving up 75% completions, that's that. If Sawyer Robertson or DeQuan Finn, whoever starts, can get to that number, and then they're able to run the football, they're just going to keep moving the chains, and they're going to keep Colorado off the field, and they're going to have opportunities to score points. So while I think Colorado's secondary has some good parts, I mean, Travis Hunter for sure, I think their cornerbacks are actually like really pretty good. I don't think their safeties are that good, which is an area where I think Ashton Hawkins, Michael Trigg, Monterey Baldwin could be huge factors in this game, especially keeping that completion percentage high with those 5-yard completions that you need to move the chains or at least keep you ahead of the chain. So I think that's a really interesting factor, and another thing that really I think it trends in Baylor's direction.
Yeah. So you talked about conversions. Colorado is actually decent on third down conversions. They're 5th in the Big 12, 32.5%. The issue is that teams are going for it on 4th down against them. They're 15th in the Big 12, and they're getting converted on 85% of the time. So teams are getting into short yardage situations and converting. Now, I know Colorado's dealt with some injuries up front on the defensive line. Had a couple guys last week that were out. Still status to be determined as we're recording this. but you would think that Baylor will have that opportunity to convert third downs. And we know Dave Aranda's aggressive nature and really relying on analytics. So if he's in third and short, and obviously, fourth and short, and obviously third and short, I think he's going to take a few more risks in this game, depending on the trend of the game, because if Colorado continues to give up, you want to keep the ball away from their offense. That's what they're going to have to do it. On the other side of the ball, Baylor currently ranks third down conversion second at 26%, fourth downs at 8% at 50%, but they've only had opposing offenses have only gone forward a few times on them. So third downs key to this game, get the other offense off the field. And that was even with that first half by Air Force where they converted multiple third downs, that Baylor's defense is still ranked that high on third down. So I'm anxious to see what Baylor can do to get off the field. And that switches to the defensive side of the ball for Colorado. We haven't talked a ton about this right now or yet. We've mentioned Baylor's offense, but right now Colorado's overall defensive rankings are pretty much all bottom half of the Big 12. The schedules vary from program to program right now because they're not all playing in Big 12 play. But truthfully, there's a bunch of 12s, 16s, 15s. There are some higher ones like fumbles that they're ranked second in fumbles recovered at 2. And I think that's about it above top 5. Third downs was top 5. But outside of that, everything is pretty low. And Baylor has to they go into this game, you're looking to win, get into bowl eligibility. You look at this Colorado defense, and this is one you have to take advantage of offensively. And you mentioned making those steps and having growth with the offense as the season progresses. There's not a better time right now to take another step, because I think there is going to be some struggles with Colorado's defense, especially if they're still without multiple guys, including Shiloh Sanders that you mentioned is out with an injury.
Right. I do think that when you look at Colorado's defense, I think it's pretty clear that they're a bottom half of the Big 12 type defense. I mean, they might even be kind of in that double digit range when you kind of look at 10 to 16, somewhere in there. They're not very good. And there's really not anything that you can look at and say, wow, they're great at that. The only position that I do think Baylor will likely have some challenges with is cornerback. I do think they are good there with their 2 corners on the outside. The problem is they can't stop the run very well, as we've mentioned a couple times. And then the safeties, I don't think can cover. I don't think they can really cover in the slot. You lose Shiloh Sanders. I think that's a fairly significant loss. So I think there's areas there for Baylor to really attack. And if the passing game continues to take a step forward, the efficiency should be there. Colorado's 86th in passing efficiency defense. They're going to give up completions. They're going to give up explosive plays. And if Baylor can hit on some of those, which they've actually been pretty good at, they're 27th in pass yards per completion. If they can hit on a few of those, it's really going to open things up, continue to open up things for the run game, which, like I said, I feel pretty good about Baylor's run game going into this one. It needs to continue to take steps forward as there is a talent jump here, but schematically and just the overall cohesion of the defense on the opposing side, I feel like there's an area for Baylor to take advantage there up front and continue to run the football. So that's another area that I'm very intrigued by, but one where I feel like Baylor has an advantage. I think just looking at this game, I feel like Baylor should be able to go into Boulder and post somewhere in the high 20s, maybe low 30s in this game.
Yeah. So if Baylor's surge continues on the offensive line running game, which it's to be determined at this point, but right now Baylor averages 4.15 yards per carry, which ranks 10th in the Big 12, while Colorado gives up 4.01 yards per carry, which ranks 11th. So it's kind of a wash right now, but I think there's an opportunity for Baylor's running game to get going. It starts with the offensive line, creating holes, but Bryson Washington, Dominic Richard are much different running backs than what were used with Dawson Pendergrass. Richard Reese I think he's going to have his role, like we saw at the end of the Air Force game, getting on the edge, but you need guys who can be physical between the line of scrimmage. And then you mentioned in the passing game, Baylor's ranked 3rd in the Big 12 at 8.8 yards per attempt, while Colorado defensively ranks 11th. So the matchup there is favorable to Baylor, especially considering Colorado really hasn't faced a strong passing team. And I'm not calling Baylor a strong passing team, but they just haven't, in a lot of ways, they haven't been tested the way that Baylor could potentially test them with this particular offense. So there are some matchup opportunities. Those numbers are kind of, they have holes in them right now because of the differences in scheduling, the differences in opponents, but it does give us an indication of what to look at. So I think there's opportunities, and just like, potentially Colorado has some advantages with their offense against Baylor secondary. We just don't know yet. And we'll find out pretty quickly as this game gets started, depending on schemes and what each teams are trying to do defensively.
Exactly. And I think it's going to be very huge to see, is Carl Williams going to be back to play star? Dave Aranda mentioned him in the press conference as a guy who it feels like he's getting close. He practiced. And so he practiced to start the week. So we'll see how that kind of progresses going forward. But they need him in this game. He's been dealing with a knee sprain, according to Aranda. So we'll see kind of, is he able to go? Is he going to be fully available? I kind of think he will be. I think he was probably close to playing or maybe could have played this past week, but I do think that he'll be ready to go for the Colorado game. Either way, Kendrick Simpkins has been fine. He's played a lot of snaps. He can create some pressure, but I think in coverage, Carl is just a big upgrade there. And I do think that he's a guy that they really need. Also mentioned Cooper Lands, which is another guy who really good against the run, but I think he's also in a matchup like this could be sneaky with the pressures, especially on the interior of the defensive line, because when you can condense that pocket, if you can push the guard or the center back into the quarterback, again, that's just another form of creating havoc. And that's kind of what you want. You want kind of all sides to be secured. You want Shedeur to have to try to get outside the pocket consistently and feel uncomfortable. So we'll see on him. He's questionable as well with an ankle injury. Also practiced to start the week. So a couple question marks there with some key players for Baylor, but and also key players who I do think takes this defense to another level. I think both those guys are very key to kind of what Baylor wants to do. And in this matchup, Carl Williams is, I think, very, very important for this defense, especially trying to deal with all these weapons that Colorado has. You need guys in the slot that can really cover.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I think with Carl, specifically, it makes a lot of sense. But you mentioned with Cooper, like if this schematically goes the way I expect it to, you're going to need both of those guys for different reasons. And it's because you're dropping a lot of guys in coverage and you're wanting to control the run game, the scramble game by Sanders with your defensive front. And so if you can keep them contained while also creating pressure and not having windows to throw into, or he's going to need more time to get the ball off. Like there's so many variables that those two specific guys bring to the table. So it will be interesting. We're getting a little bit past time here, but I do want to mention special teams. Baylor, once again, I thought had a pretty good effort special teams wise against Air Force, blocked a punt. Isaiah Hankins hit 3 field goals. But right now, that looks to be what Baylor's doing special teams, the opposite of what Colorado's doing. Colorado ranks 12th in punting and 16th in field goal percentage on the season, while Baylor ranks first in punting with 57.88 yards per punt, and field goals at 75% is actually number 6 in the Big 12. And one of those, I felt bad for Isaiah because he kicked it late. He'd been drilling them the entire game. Really, for the last couple of weeks, he'd been drilling them. I think he just relaxed a little bit and missed it. So that number could be potentially higher. But that's another area, man. Like I think that there's something to this in a close game. If you can win that field position battle with punting, but then also kick field goals. Like if Baylor's defense truly becomes kind of a strong bend but don't break, and you're letting them kick long field goals, that could be major late in this game.
It absolutely could be. And for as explosive as we think Colorado can be, just their overall deficiencies on the offensive side running the football has really kept them from scoring a ton, right? From just, lighting up the scoreboard. They're really a team that is going to score somewhere around, 28 to 30 in a good game, it feels like. And in a bad game, they can score as low as 10 points, as we saw in the Nebraska game. So I think it is key, the special teams, because if you can pin them deep and force them to have to be really good throwing the ball, 90, 85, 80 yards down the field, that can really flip the game because, they really have not been able to do that consistently. And so I think that is a key area. You force the offense just to be a little more perfect, a little more efficient, and then things can happen, numbers can skew, and you're forcing them to run more plays in which you can force turnovers, get sacks, make them even more uncomfortable. And so, I do think it's an area that's key. Also on the road, very important to make your field goals. Very, very important. You got to be able to, when you get chances to score points, you got to take advantage of that. So they really need Hankins to continue to provide a spark there. I'll also say, Josh Cameron continues to be very reliable on punt return. And so I think that that's another area where if you can find some hidden yardage there and create more points and put more pressure on Colorado, that's kind of where you want to be. Because if you're forcing Colorado to play from behind, like we saw in that Nebraska game, things can kind of unwind a little bit for them.
Yeah. So a lot to get to this week. We'll have some interviews with players and coaches, Baylor players and coaches. We're going to talk keys to the game. We're going to have a special mailbag edition later this week where you have the opportunity to ask us questions on our social medias or on SicEm365.com. But man, I think this is a game that's a kind of a pivotal game for Baylor. You can either learn a lot or you can learn a lot in a good way or learn a lot in a bad way. So I'm curious to see the direction of this game. But all right, Baylor family, that's going to do it for today's episode of Inside Baylor Sports, the official daily podcast of Baylor Athletics. Thank you to each of you for listening. And for Grayson Grunhafer, I'm Colt Barber. Have a great Tuesday and Sic 'em Baylor.